Prison guard bet his badge. The black inmate would break. He never raised his voice once. $20 says he cracks by Friday. Officer Rick Dawson said it low, leaning against the cell block railing, watching Marcus Vaughn fold his blanket into the same precise square he folded it every single morning at Riverbend Correctional. The other guard, a younger man named Cody Ellis, glanced nervously down the row. "Dawson, come on, not again." "I'm serious," Dawson said. "I'll bet my badge on it. Man's been in here 3 years. Everybody breaks eventually. I just haven't found the right pressure point yet." Marcus didn't look up from his bunk. He'd learned, a long time ago, that the things guards said when they thought you couldn't hear were rarely meant to reach you at all. They were meant to reach each other. Dawson pushed off the railing and walked slow toward Marcus's cell, keys jangling deliberately loud against his belt. "Vaughn," he said, "cell shakedown. Everything out. Now." Marcus stood, set his folded blanket aside, and stepped back without a word, watching as Dawson tore through 3 years of careful order. His letters, his books, the small photograph of his daughter tucked inside his Bible, scattering all of it across the concrete floor with a kind of casual, practiced cruelty. Marcus said nothing. His jaw was tight. His hands stayed at his sides. "Nothing to say?" Dawson asked, kicking the photograph further across the floor. "No, sir," Marcus said quietly. Dawson smiled like he'd won something, though the flicker of frustration behind his eyes said otherwise, and he turned and walked away, already telling Cody he'd have the man cracking within the week. He had no idea that 3 states away, in a small office stacked with case files, a woman was reading Marcus Vaughn's name for the very first time. And what she found in that file was about to change everything. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. I read as many as I can. And if you enjoy powerful justice stories with unforgettable twists like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now let's go back to where Marcus Vaughn's story really began. Before Riverbend Correctional, before the trial, before any of it, Marcus Vaughn had been a 10th grade history teacher and junior varsity football coach at Lincoln High School in Columbus, Ohio. The kind of teacher students remembered for years after they left his classroom. He'd grown up the son of a postal worker and a nurse, the middle child of 5, raised in a house where dinner table conversations about current events were as regular as prayer before meals. His parents had instilled in him early a belief that dignity wasn't something other people gave you. It was something you carried yourself, regardless of circumstance. Marcus married his college sweetheart, Angela, at 24, and by 31, they had a daughter named Zoe, a bright, curious 7-year-old who thought her father hung the moon and told anyone who'd listen that she was going to be a teacher just like him someday. He coached football because he believed deeply that a locker room could teach a teenage boy more about character than almost anything else in his life. Discipline, humility, the value of showing up even when nobody was watching. He was known around Lincoln High for staying late to tutor struggling students, for driving kids home when their rides fell through, for the particular steadiness in his voice that made even the most chaotic classroom settle within minutes of him walking through the door. None of that mattered on the night everything changed. 3 years before the story that would eventually reach Officer Rick Dawson's cell block, Marcus was arrested and charged with an armed robbery at a convenience store 4 miles from his house, a crime that occurred at 9:40 p.m. on a Tuesday night, based almost entirely on the shaky identification of a single eyewitness who glimpsed the robber for less than 8 seconds under fluorescent lighting from across a parking lot. Marcus had been home that night, grading essays at his kitchen table while Angela put Zoe to bed. He had no alibi beyond his own family's word, no security footage from his own street, nothing but the truth, which, in a courtroom moving too fast with a public defender carrying 80 other cases, proved devastatingly insufficient. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Marcus was convicted, sentenced to 12 years, and transferred to Riverbend Correctional Facility 11 weeks later, leaving behind a wife who refused to stop fighting for him and a daughter who wouldn't fully understand, for years, why her father had simply disappeared from their lives. Marcus carried that injustice into every single day at Riverbend. Not with anger, though anger would have been justified, but with a quiet, unshakable discipline that confused the guards far more than defiance ever could have. He mentored younger inmates. He led a weekly literacy program in the library. He never once, in 3 years, raised his voice at another human being inside those walls. Officer Rick Dawson found that discipline unbearable, and he had made it his personal mission to break it. Rick Dawson had worked at Riverbend Correctional for 11 years, and somewhere in the middle of that decade, the job had curdled something in him that he no longer noticed in himself at all. He'd started, if you asked him, with good intentions. A young man from a rural county wanting steady work, a badge, a pension. But 11 years of watching men come and go, 11 years of a system that rewarded control over compassion, had hollowed something out and filled the space with a particular kind of appetite for dominance. Among the guards, Dawson ran what everyone quietly called the pool, an informal, entirely unauthorized betting system where officers wagered small amounts of money on which inmates would eventually break under pressure, act out, land themselves in solitary, or otherwise confirm whatever cynical theory Dawson held about the men in his custody. It had started small, years ago, a joke shared over coffee in the break room. It had grown, slowly, into something far uglier. Extra shakedowns targeted at specific inmates, privileges revoked for invented infractions, small cruelties designed specifically to provoke a reaction Dawson could then use as proof he'd won. Most of the men eventually gave him what he wanted: a shouted insult, a shove against a wall, something that landed them in disciplinary segregation, and, not coincidentally, put a few dollars in Dawson's pocket from whichever guard had bet against him. Marcus Vaughn had never given him anything. 3 years of shakedowns, of confiscated mail, of deliberately delayed medical requests, of small manufactured humiliations in front of other inmates. And Marcus had met every single one of them with the same unshaken calm, the same quiet, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," the same refusal to hand Dawson the one thing he wanted most. It had become, for Dawson, less about the money in the pool and more about something darker and more personal. A need to prove that a man like Marcus Vaughn, educated, composed, respected by inmates and even some guards, could still be broken by someone who wore the uniform Dawson wore. He didn't examine that need too closely. He rarely examined anything about himself too closely. What Dawson didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, standing in that cell block scattering Marcus's photographs across a concrete floor, was that his own personnel file, 3 counties away, was already sitting open on a desk inside the state's Department of Corrections Internal Affairs office, flagged for review after a pattern of complaints too consistent to keep ignoring. The public humiliation came on a Tuesday morning in the prison yard, 6 weeks after the cell shakedown, in front of nearly 80 inmates gathered for recreation hour. Marcus had filed a formal written grievance 3 days earlier, not on his own behalf, but for a younger inmate named Darius Coleman, a 19-year-old who had been denied his prescribed asthma medication for 4 consecutive days. Under circumstances Marcus believed, quietly and carefully, were retaliatory rather than accidental. Dawson found out about the grievance within hours. Grievances had a way of finding him quickly at Riverbend, filtered through a network of guards who understood, without ever needing to be told directly, which complaints Dawson wanted flagged. "Vaughn!" Dawson called out across the yard, his voice carrying deliberately loud, drawing eyes from every corner of the recreation area. "Heard you've been writing letters again, playing lawyer for Coleman." Marcus stopped where he stood, near the basketball court, and turned to face him. "I filed a grievance regarding a medical concern, sir. That's within my rights." "Your rights," Dawson repeated, walking closer, other guards drifting nearer now too, sensing the shift in the yard's energy. "You know what I think your problem is, Vaughn? I think you like feeling important in here. Big man on the block, everybody's favorite teacher." Around them, the yard had gone noticeably quieter, inmates slowing their games, their conversations, watching the exchange unfold with the particular stillness of men who had learned exactly how quickly these moments could turn. "I'm just trying to make sure a 19-year-old kid can breathe properly, sir," Marcus said, his voice level, unwavering. "Nothing more than that." Dawson's jaw tightened, the crowd's attention clearly not going the direction he wanted. He stepped closer, close enough that his voice dropped just slightly, meant now for Marcus alone rather than the gathered yard. "You think you're better than everybody else in here," Dawson said quietly. "Think that calm little act makes you special. It doesn't. You're a number, same as the rest of them. And numbers don't get to file grievances that make me look bad." "With respect, sir," Marcus said, "I didn't file it to make anyone look bad. I filed it because a kid couldn't breathe and somebody had to say something." Something shifted in Dawson's face then. Not quite anger, something closer to genuine confusion, the particular unsettled look of a man encountering a kind of resistance he had no framework for understanding, because it wasn't resistance at all. It was simply conviction, delivered without a single raised syllable. "Cell block lockdown," Dawson announced abruptly to the yard, turning away from Marcus, his voice sharp with the particular petulance of a man who had just lost an exchange he couldn't quite explain losing. "Recreation's over. Everybody back inside." As the yard filed back toward the cell block, murmurs passed quietly between inmates, word of what had just happened moving fast through Riverbend's careful, unspoken network. The story of Marcus Vaughn standing calm in the face of Dawson's anger, already beginning to take on its own quiet legend among the men who called that place home. Dawson watched him go, and something in his chest tightened with a familiar, ugly certainty. "This one's different," he thought. "This one needs more." He had no idea yet just how wrong that instinct would prove to be. The retaliation escalated slowly and deliberately over the following 2 months, each incident small enough on its own to defy easy documentation, but forming, together, an unmistakable pattern. Marcus's mail began arriving weeks late, sometimes not arriving at all. Letters from Angela, drawings from Zoe, correspondence from his appellate, attorney that mysteriously never seemed to reach him on schedule. His weekly library program was suspended for a month over an invented safety concern that no other program at Riverbend faced. A scheduled family visit was canceled without explanation 2 hours before. Angela and Zoe arrived at the facility, forcing them to make the 4-hour drive home without ever seeing him. Through all of it, Marcus maintained the same steady discipline that had made him such an unbearable target for Dawson in the first place. He filed each grievance calmly, methodically through proper channels, understanding that outbursts would only prove exactly the narrative. Dawson wanted to build, but the toll was visible, even if his voice never rose to show it. He grew thinner over those 2 months. He slept less. In quiet moments in the library, mentoring the younger men, other inmates noticed a weariness settling into him that hadn't been there before. Not despair exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. Darius Coleman, the young man whose grievance had started it all, found Marcus alone in the library one evening, staring at a blank page in his notebook rather than writing. "You good, Mr. Vaughn?" Darius asked quietly. Marcus looked up, managing a small, tired smile. "I'm all right, Darius. Just missing my daughter more than usual today. You never let it show, Darius said. How do you do that? Dawson's been coming at you for months and you never once let him see it get to you. Marcus considered the question for a long moment, setting down his pen. Because the day I let him see it get to me, Marcus said, is the day he wins something that was never his to take. My composure is mine. It's the one thing in this place that's still entirely, completely mine. I'm not handing it over to a man who thinks breaking me is a game worth playing. Darius nodded slowly, something in his young face settling into a kind of quiet resolve of its own. I filed my own grievance last week about the medication delays continuing. Figured if you could keep doing it, I could too. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. Pride, mixed with worry for what that courage might cost the boy. Be careful, Marcus said gently. Dawson doesn't lose gracefully. He had no way of knowing, sitting in that library that evening, just how true those words would prove to be. Or that somewhere far beyond Riverbend's walls, a woman named Rebecca Hale was, at that exact moment, opening a file with his name on it for the very first time. Rebecca Hale worked as a senior investigator for a regional innocence advocacy organization based 200 miles from Riverbend, the kind of small, chronically underfunded nonprofit that reviewed hundreds of wrongful conviction claims a year and had the resources to fully investigate only a fraction of them. Marcus's case had landed on her desk 18 months earlier, submitted by Angela through a lengthy application process, and had sat largely untouched in a growing backlog until a chance conversation at a legal conference connected Rebecca with a forensic consultant reviewing old eyewitness identification procedures across the state. What caught Rebecca's attention, reading through Marcus's file for the first time, wasn't a single dramatic piece of evidence. It was smaller than that. A footnote in the original case file mentioning that the convenience store's security camera, initially reported as non-functional on the night of the robbery, had in fact been repaired 11 days before the incident, a detail that had never made it into the trial record at all. It took Rebecca 3 weeks of records requests, phone calls, and one deeply reluctant conversation with a former store manager to track down what had happened to that footage, discovering, to her genuine astonishment, that it had been logged into evidence at the time of the original investigation, then quietly misfiled under an unrelated case number and never reviewed by anyone, including Marcus's own overwhelmed public defender. She watched that footage for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in her small office, and within the first 90 seconds, understood exactly why this case deserved far more attention than it had ever received. The footage showed the actual robbery clearly enough to identify the perpetrator's build, clothing, and distinctive tattoo on his left forearm, none of which matched Marcus Vaughn in any respect. Rebecca sat back in her chair, staring at the paused frame on her screen, feeling the particular weight that came with this kind of discovery. Not celebration. Not yet. Just the sober, careful recognition that a man's entire life had been altered by evidence that existed the whole time, sitting misfiled in a records room, waiting for someone to simply look. She picked up her phone and began making the first of what would become dozens of calls over the following months, to the original prosecutor's office, to the state crime lab, to a retired detective who remembered the case only vaguely, but agreed, cautiously, to speak with her. She did not yet know Marcus's name beyond the file in front of her. She did not know about Rick Dawson, or the cell shakedowns, or the mail delayed on purpose, or the daughter 4 hours away who still kept a photograph of her father on her nightstand. She knew only that something in this case was deeply, unmistakably wrong, and that she wasn't going to stop until she understood exactly how wrong it truly was. 2 months after Rebecca Hale first opened Marcus's file, Riverbend Correctional received formal notice that his case was under active review by the state's Conviction Integrity Unit, a development that moved through the facility's administrative channels with the particular slowness of institutional bureaucracy, reaching the warden's desk, then department heads, then, eventually, filtering down toward the guards who supervised. Marcus's daily life, without any of them fully grasping what it meant. Rick Dawson heard about it secondhand, through a comment overheard in the guard break room, and dismissed it immediately as exactly the kind of hollow legal maneuvering he'd seen a dozen times before from inmates and their families, appeals filed, hopes raised, nothing ever actually changing. If anything, the news seemed to sharpen something in him rather than give him pause. "Guess Vaughn thinks he's getting out soon," Dawson said to Cody Ellis one afternoon, watching Marcus cross the yard toward the library. "Bet he's feeling pretty good about himself right about now." "Maybe we should ease up a little," Cody said carefully. "If there's actually something to this review—" "There's never anything to it," Dawson said flatly. "I've seen 100 of these. Man's got a good lawyer stirring up false hope. That's all this is. Doesn't change anything in here." He decided in that moment that whatever was happening outside, Riverbend's walls made his own personal mission inside them more urgent, not less. If Marcus Vaughn believed he was close to some kind of vindication, Dawson reasoned, then this was exactly the moment his composure might finally crack under. Just a little more pressure. He escalated a false disciplinary report, alleging Marcus had threatened another inmate. An accusation 4 separate witnesses would later confirm was entirely fabricated, but which was enough in the moment to land Marcus in disciplinary segregation for 11 days, cut off from mail, from the library, from any contact with the outside review that was quietly, steadily building his case. Marcus spent those 11 days in a 6x9 cell with nothing but a thin mattress and his own thoughts, and for the first time in 3 years, something in him came dangerously close to breaking. Not into anger, but into a despair he'd successfully held at bay through every other cruelty Dawson had thrown at him. On the 9th day, a guard slipped a folded note beneath his cell door during a shift change, an act that violated at least 3 facility policies and could have cost the guard his job entirely. They're building something outside. Rebecca Hale, Innocence Project. Hold on. CE. Marcus read the note 4 times, his hands trembling slightly, before carefully tearing it into pieces small enough to swallow, understanding immediately the risk Cody Ellis had just taken on his behalf. For the first time in 11 days, sitting alone in that narrow cell, Marcus allowed himself something he had rationed carefully for 3 long years. He allowed himself hope. Rebecca Hale's investigation reached its critical turning point 4 months later, when the retired detective she'd been quietly corresponding with finally agreed to a formal recorded interview and revealed something that reshaped the entire case. Detective Frank Torres had led the original robbery investigation 11 years earlier, and in the recorded interview, sitting across from Rebecca in his modest retirement home, he admitted something that had clearly weighed on him for over a decade. "There was another suspect early on," Torres said, his voice heavy with the particular regret of a man finally speaking a truth he'd buried for years. "A man named Curtis Bell. Similar build to the eyewitness description. Prior record for armed robbery. We pulled him in for questioning within the first week. What happened to that lead?" Rebecca asked. "The eyewitness identified Vaughn from a photo lineup before we'd finished running down Bell's alibi," Torres said. "Once we had an ID, the case moved fast. Prosecutor's office wanted an arrest. I always had questions about it. I raised them, got told the case was solid enough to move forward." "Did anyone ever formally rule out Curtis Bell?" Torres was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "Not that I'm aware of. Once Vaughn was charged, the file on Bell just sat there. Nobody ever closed that loop." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken, the pieces of the case shifting into a clearer, more damning shape than she'd even anticipated. It took another 6 weeks of careful, methodical work to locate Curtis Bell, now 44 years old, serving an unrelated sentence in a different state facility for a robbery committed 3 years after Marcus's conviction. A robbery, Rebecca discovered with growing certainty, that matched the original convenience store crimes method almost exactly. The distinctive forearm tattoo visible in the recovered security footage matched Curtis Bell's booking photo from his subsequent arrest with a precision that no reasonable person could dismiss as coincidence. Rebecca requested an immediate DNA comparison between evidence preserved from the original crime scene and Curtis Bell's existing database profile from his later conviction. The results came back 9 days later, and Rebecca read them standing in her office, feeling the full weight of 18 months of work finally crystallize into something undeniable. Something that would finally, after 3 years, force open the door that had kept Marcus Vaughn locked away for a crime he had never, in any sense, committed. She picked up her phone immediately to call the Conviction Integrity Unit, her hands unsteady with an emotion she rarely allowed herself in this line of work. She had found the truth. Now came the harder part, making an entire system move fast enough to matter. The formal hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the county courthouse, 6 weeks after Rebecca's DNA results confirmed what Detective Torres's decade-old doubts had first suggested. Marcus sat at the defense table in a suit Angela had brought him that morning, the first time he'd worn anything besides a prison uniform in 3 years. His hands folded carefully in his lap, his expression composed in the same steady way it had remained through everything that came before. Behind him, the courtroom gallery was fuller than anyone expected for what should have been a routine post-conviction hearing. Angela and Zoe in the front row, Rebecca Hale seated beside the prosecution's own conviction integrity attorney, and, near the back, a small cluster of Riverbend inmates' family members who had heard whispers of what was happening and come to witness it themselves. Judge Margaret Wilson called the hearing to order, and Rebecca stood to present the evidence her team had assembled. The misfiled security footage, Detective Torres's recorded testimony, the DNA match connecting Curtis Bell definitively to the original crime scene. The courtroom listened in near-total silence as each piece was laid out, methodical and undeniable, the case against Marcus Vaughn dissolving in real time before everyone present. "Your Honor," the state's conviction integrity attorney said finally, standing to address the court. "Given the totality of this evidence, the state moves to vacate Mr. Vaughn's conviction immediately and join the defense's motion for his release." Judge Wilson looked out over the courtroom, her expression carrying the particular gravity of a moment she clearly understood extended far beyond the legal formalities in front of her. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, turning toward him directly, "on behalf of a system that failed you profoundly, I am vacating your conviction, effective immediately. You are free to go." The gallery erupted, Angela's hands flying to her face, Zoe, now 10 years old, crying openly beside her mother, the small cluster of families near the back, rising to their feet in a wave of applause that Judge Wilson allowed to continue far longer than typical courtroom decorum usually permitted. Marcus sat still for a long moment, absorbing words he had waited 3 years to hear, and then, slowly, allowed himself to stand, turning toward his family with an expression that finally, after 3 years of careful composure, cracked open into something raw and unguarded. He crossed the courtroom in a few long strides and pulled Angela and Zoe both into his arms, the 3 of them holding on to each other in the middle of the aisle while the gallery continued applauding around them. But the story of that day was not finished yet, because sitting quietly in the back row, having come to observe the hearing after receiving an unexpected subpoena 2 weeks earlier, was Officer Rick Dawson, watching the collapse of a case he had spent months building his own private cruelty around, and understanding, with a cold, sinking certainty, that his own reckoning had only just begun. The state's Department of Corrections Internal Affairs investigation into Rick Dawson had actually begun 11 months before Marcus's exoneration hearing. Launched quietly after Darius Coleman's grievance about medication delays triggered a routine compliance review that, once opened, uncovered far more than anyone initially expected. Investigators found the informal betting pool first, confirmed by 3 separate guards, including Cody Ellis, who provided a detailed statement describing years of wagers placed on which inmates could be provoked into disciplinary violations, along with a pattern of targeted retaliation against inmates who filed formal grievances. Marcus's file within that investigation grew heaviest of all. Delayed mail logs, the canceled family visit with no documented justification, the fabricated disciplinary report that had sent him into 11 days of segregation, now directly contradicted by 4 inmate witness statements collected independently of each other, all describing the same version of events with striking consistency. When Rebecca Hale's exoneration case became public 2 weeks after the courtroom hearing, drawing regional news coverage of a wrongful conviction finally overturned after 3 years, the timing collided directly with the internal affairs investigation reaching its own conclusion. The state held a formal disciplinary hearing 8 weeks later, and Rick Dawson sat across the table from a review board that included Warden Patricia Nguyen, a Department of Corrections regional director, and providing sworn testimony via video, both Cody Ellis and, remarkably, Marcus Vaughn himself. Now a free man testifying not from any desire for revenge, but from a belief that Dawson's pattern needed to be stopped before another inmate endured what he had. "I want to be clear," Marcus said during his testimony, his voice as level and unshaken as it had been through every confrontation in that cell block, "that I'm not here because I want to see this man punished for punishment's sake. I'm here because the same pattern that targeted me almost certainly targeted men who didn't have an innocence case building quietly in the background to eventually protect them. Somebody needs to be accountable for that." The review board's decision came down 3 weeks later. Rick Dawson was formally terminated from the Department of Corrections, his certification revoked, the informal betting pool cited explicitly in the board's findings as a fundamental and sustained abuse of institutional authority incompatible with any continued role in corrections. He surrendered his badge in a small administrative office at the very facility where he had once bet it so casually on breaking a man who never once gave him the satisfaction. Cody Ellis, whose cooperation had proven essential to both investigations, kept his position at Riverbend, promoted 18 months later to a supervisory role focused specifically on grievance oversight. A quiet irony that Marcus, hearing about it later from Darius Coleman, appreciated more than he let on. Darius Coleman himself was released 2 years later, his own sentence completed, and enrolled the following fall in community college with Marcus's encouragement and a letter of recommendation that Marcus had written the very week of his own release, unable to imagine a better use of his first free days than helping ensure someone else's future looked brighter than his own recent past. 6 months after his release, Marcus stood in front of his old classroom at Lincoln High School, reinstated with full back pay and benefits after the school board voted unanimously to welcome him back. The wrongful conviction that had once cost him everything now formally and publicly acknowledged as exactly what it had always been. Zoe, now 11, sat in the front row of his classroom on his very first day back, having begged the principal for permission to spend her half-day off from her own school watching her father teach for the first time in her memory. "You okay, Dad?" she whispered, as students began filing in, glancing at their teacher with the particular curious energy of kids who had heard the story on the local news and weren't entirely sure how to greet a man who'd become, in their eyes, something between a teacher and a legend. Marcus smiled at his daughter, feeling something settle deep in his chest that 3 years of quiet discipline had never quite allowed him to fully access Until this exact moment. I'm more than okay, he said softly. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. He turned to face his new class, watching them settle into their seats, and began the same way he'd begun every class in the years before everything had been taken from him, with a simple, steady question meant to remind 17-year-olds that the world was larger and more complicated than they yet understood. Today, Marcus said, we're going to talk about what justice actually means and why it so often depends on people willing to keep looking, even after everyone else has already decided to stop. He didn't need to mention his own story for the lesson to land. Every student in that room already knew it. But watching their faces, quiet and attentive in a way he remembered from years before, everything changed. Marcus understood that some lessons taught themselves simply by the person standing at the front of the room still being there to teach them at all. That evening, at home, Angela found him on their back porch, staring out at a modest Ohio backyard he had spent 3 years afraid he might never see again. "How was it?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Marcus was quiet for a moment, searching for words adequate to a feeling too large for easy summary. "It felt," he said finally, "like getting my voice back. Not because I ever lost it in there, but because for 3 years it only mattered to me whether I stayed steady. Today, for the first time, it mattered to someone else, too." Angela took his hand, and together they watched the sun go down over their small backyard, the quiet, ordinary evening carrying a weight neither of them would ever again take for granted.